Like I said, I'm going to talk, of course, about the continuation with the Middle Ages again. We're on that course subject right now. I think from last time I had talked about medieval times from, I think we talked up to the Franks and all of that. I know was one thing I did. And then the next thing I need to get into is I need to get into and talk about, the Viking era or Viking Age that comes in that we have. So-called Vikings. They call it different names, of course, today. The Viking Age is a period that kind of covers from like the 9th to about the 11th centuries. So it kind of starts actually close to about 800. There's a case where the Vikings first hit Scotland. I don't know if you know about this, but in northern Scotland, there was an island called Lindisfarne Island. That was the first place they actually attacked in basically part of Europe. And so I think that's about when the Viking Age kind of starts at that point, more or less. But really like the 9th century, and it goes up to like sometime in the 1000s in the 11th century. And the Viking Age was a period where the Scandinavian peoples descended from Northern Europe, and they basically attacked and settled different parts, of course, of Europe, mostly Northern Europe, where they attacked more than anything, and also the North Atlantic. They also went into as well. And like the video said, these Viking people, of course, originated, of course, from the area of Scandinavia, which the main areas they came out of were mostly those three they talked about, which were Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Maybe Finland too, which is kind of east of that. They probably were in there too as well. But I think Sweden was maybe part of Finland though. But and Christians called them all kinds of names. Of course, the common name they called them was the Norse, which the term Norse meant north. They came from the north, I guess. And so Norsemen or Northmen was the common names that people called them. And then they also had a more derogatory name that, of course, they also called them, which was the Viking. Viking was a name that meant that they were like pirates or bandits, which is what a lot of European Christians viewed the Vikings as, these people that came in and raided their cities and attacked and killed them and all that. And so that's the kind of stereotypical view that they have of the Viking, more or less, in history. But a lot of that's not true. The Vikings weren't all like this. They have their own common culture. I think most of the Vikings were a combination of sailors and farmers is pretty much what we know about them. And it's not like Hollywood. In Hollywood, they show like Vikings with these helmets with horns on them, all that. That's some just made up stuff. They didn't have horns on their helmets. So that's just made up. Like my daughter was talking about that. She's like, "They don't?" It's like, yeah, they don't. But anyway, it's made up stuff later, Hollywood. But let me get into and talk about the Vikings. Now, why did they do this? Like, why did they leave Scandinavia? There's all kinds of reasons for why they left. They think overpopulation is one theory. The fact that, remember in the video, they were talking about all these fjords and mountains they have everywhere. It's hard to really farm and all that there because of that. If you ever been to like Norway, and so a lot of them left because of that. Some people think it was climatic reasons and things were kind of warming up. And then they had the so-called medieval warm period that kind of comes in. So that's another reason. Then also the fact that they wanted to raid parts of Europe, which were maybe more wealthier. And so that was another reason of why they expanded different parts of the northern hemisphere. So it's kind of debated about, why they left, more or less. The Vikings were very warlike, very paganistic. They would later convert to Christianity, over time. But originally they worshipped a lot of these warlike gods that were well known. Like there's one you, of course, probably have heard of, which is the most famous one is Odin. There's an image of Odin, which is some kind of image that they, I guess, worshipped or whatever. And Odin was basically the god of the warriors. He supposedly resided in what is called Asgard. And he had this enormous hall that he lived in. And they later call the Viking heaven, they call it Valhalla. And of course, all Vikings that died in battle wanted to, go to Viking heaven and be with, Odin. And that was their big goal they wanted to do, and all that. So that's Odin they have. Then they have also, of course, the another one. And Odin, by the way, was also sometimes called Woden. Woden. And I don't know if you ever thought about this much, but that's where the name Wednesday comes from. Wednesday is basically Odin Day. It's basically, in fact, the days of the week are named after some of the Viking gods. Thursday is Thor Day, and Friday is Frey Day. So it's kind of weird about that. But yeah, you got also Thor. Thor is pretty famous too, as well. And Thor is the one that was known for brandishing a hammer and all that, which you've probably heard of. So he was like one of two main sons of Odin. I think Balder's the other son of Odin. He's associated with mostly thunder, also lightning and storms. And so he's pretty famous. And of course, Thor, they've made movies about and all that as well. Other gods that they also have, the Vikings, he had Frey. Yeah, Frey was another one that they had, which was a male god. He was actually the brother of Freya. They're like a twin brother and sister, basically. Frey was a god of mostly fertility, but he was also associated with things like kingship among the Vikings. And then his sister Freya was kind of like the Viking version of like Aphrodite or something, associated with love, beauty, and sex, fertility, etc. You may have heard of Loki. Yeah, Loki was another famous Viking god as well. Mostly a god of luck and fortune. Also a god of mischief, and he was often known as the trickster god as well, so-called trickster god. So Loki's kind of well known. Balder, not so much. I never heard of Balder, but Balder was another son of Odin. Basically, Balder was a brother of Thor, and he was associated with mostly bravery, but also beauty and light as well. So those are kind of like some of the Viking gods. They have other Viking gods, but those are the main ones that they had. But later, the Vikings would, become Christians, and they would get rid of, their old pagan gods, over time. Now, of course, the other thing you need to talk about the Vikings, which is, of course, well known, is like it went out for some reason. But what's well known, of course, is that the so-called Viking ships, of course, and Viking ships, as you saw in the little video, are called long ships. It's kind of a nickname. They started calling it later. I want to say later in modern times, and like in England, they called them dragon ships because they would sometimes put animals like dragons on the front of the actual ship, like carved into the wood. And these were a type of Scandinavian type of warships that had, like you saw in the video, very shallow draft, which could basically go anywhere. So they could sail these things up seas, lakes, oceans. They practically went pretty much all over the world. In fact, the Vikings were seen as being, one of the first great explorers that you have throughout before modern times, before like Columbus and all these other explorers came later. And here's all the areas they explored at one point: North Atlantic, Baltic Sea, Mediterranean Sea, Black Sea, Caspian Sea. They went down the rivers of Russia. Do you know that? The Don, the Volga, the Dnieper rivers. So they sailed different rivers, throughout Europe and stuff like that. So they go pretty much anywhere. They're very versatile, these kind of ships. And the one that you see in the video, of course, you saw they showed it, was the so-called Osberg ship, or Osberg longship, basically. Really, Osberg ships was actually called. That's actually one of these ships that they found like in the early 1900s in Norway. It's what they call a funerary ship. And I don't know if you know, the Vikings would have these funerals where they would take somebody important, maybe like a chieftain or whatever, or a king, and they would bury him in a ship and set it on fire. So something they're kind of known for, the Vikings. So yeah, that's the Viking culture, that, which was very warlike. Here's a so where it is exactly, but there's a model. There's a model, of course, of what a Viking ship kind of looked like. So yeah, sometimes they would have like dragon heads or something like that on the front of the ship, because I know in England they called them dragon ships. It was one of the nicknames that they sometimes called them, more or less. So they used kind of like oars, and of course sails were also used for, of course, propulsion. Now let me get into, of course, the Vikings. You can see anywhere you're looking at color right there is an area that they actually went into at one point and explored or raided. Most of it was like in the northern part of Europe, like from northern Spain, northern France, northern Germany, all the way into Russia. You can see here. You can see they came down here at one point, even attacked into the Mediterranean Sea. Some Vikings even settled in Italy. I don't know if you know that or not, but Naples, area of southern Italy, like Naples and Sicily, I guess it would be, was an area that they settled in at one point right there. Black Sea, they went in here too at one point. You can see Russia and the Ukraine, pretty much over here. And also up here, Iceland. They got in Iceland, Britain as well, up into those areas. So they were pretty much all over the place, the Vikings that they explored and so on. Now, yeah, kind of get into examples like in England as example, especially the eastern part. I don't know if you see that part where it's kind of red right there, that red area. We can look kind of right here. They call that area Danelaw. And of course, the so-called Danes from Denmark crossed the North Sea. They invaded here and settled pretty much around the time of Alfred the Great, who was a king of England in like the early Middle Ages. So that was an area that they kind of settled. And you can see they even went into like northern Scotland and part of Ireland at one point they went into. Then later the Normans would take over, of course, take over England, is another thing that they would do as well. So yeah, I got all that. And of course, Iceland and Greenland, those were areas that the Vikings also settled into as well. And there's a famous Viking you may have heard of named Eric the Red. He went into and he settled what is Greenland. And he's the guy that actually came up with a name. He called it Greenland because he was trying to get people to move there, the Vikings to go settle there. And so he tricked them. He said, hey, it's green here, but it's not. And so it's kind of like a false advertisement, to got to get people to go there. Because Iceland's actually warmer than Greenland, So they had also Eric the Red had a son named Leif Ericsson, you may have heard of, who they called him later Leif the Lucky. And anyway, he became a famous Viking explorer around the turn of the 11th century, close to about 1000 CE. And Leif was famous for exploring west of Iceland, exploring around Greenland and North America. And they believe that Leif was the Viking that they think discovered part of North America, which they think is now what they call Eastern Canada today. So that's something that he was known for. And if you know about the Vikings were considered the first Europeans to discover America. That was around about close to 500 some years, before Columbus would of course discover America, close to 1500. And so what happened was, because of Leif Ericsson discovering this landmass that was in what they think is Eastern Canada, the Vikings decided to create a permanent settlement there, which they called it different names. The most common name they called it was Vinland, which there's a debate about what Vinland meant. Some people think it meant wine land, or some people say Vineland, because apparently in some stories the Vikings told they found wild grapes growing there, which they made wine out of, and so on. The Vikings didn't stay there. They think sometime in the 11th century, they abandoned it. And because of the fact that they kept getting attacked by people in North America, which were Native American type tribes, I think later some of the different Indians that are in Eastern, I think like the Iroquois and all those other Indians, they have Huron, I guess, that are kind of living in that area later that they got. But they kept attacking them, and the Vikings called them Screelings and all that. And so they left sometime in the probably mid 11th century, and they didn't come back, the Vikings. And Europeans wouldn't come back until Columbus discovered America. Although actually that area where they think it is, they think that maybe Vinland was on Newfoundland Island, maybe. It's been a debate about there in Nova Scotia even too. But it's not until like 1490s that you have anybody really come back and explore that area. Right. So anyway, kind of talking about the Vikings. And here's a map. There's a map actually they found later in, I think, early modern times, which is called the Vinland map. Hold on a second here. Oh, hey, come on in. Somebody's coming in. Let me expand this if you don't mind. But we're talking about the Vikings at this point. The Vinland map, which you see on that map right there. Come on in. Hey. This is like a map that was, they think, maybe created around the time of Columbus's, like maybe 15th century map. It actually depicts Vinland, which they believe, I think it's believed to be somewhere around, well, I think he got cut off is what happened in this map, but it's supposed to be around here. It's where it is. We're next to Greenland. Looks like it got cut off there for some reason in the map. But they're not sure that's a real map, if that's really accurate or not about what it is. But it may be a map depicting where it was and all that. All right, let me talk about also about Viking expansion. So besides, Eric the Red and Leif Ericsson, doing some exploring, and you have these settlements which are right here. They also had a few others, like the Normans were famous for creating kind of a settlement. And then he also had the Vikings in Russia. Those were two other things that were known also for the Viking period as well. They had what they call the Normans. The Normans were believed to be Norwegian Vikings that around the 10th century settled in northern France, area now called Normandy today. And the Normans became a mix of a culture that was like Franco-Viking is what it was. So it was a mix of the culture. So you have the Franks, well, actually the French, which is what they were, I guess, originally. So the French and, of course, the Viking culture. And they, of course, adopted French as their language. And then over time, they converted to Catholicism by the 11th century. And over time, it grew into a state called the Duchy of Normandy, which is a vassal state to the Kingdom of France at the time. And what happened was the Normans, who didn't really have a state like a kingdom or anything like that, eventually in the 11th century, late 11th century, decided to invade England and take it over. And that became known as the so-called Norman Conquest, which you may have heard of. You probably heard of William the Conqueror, of course. William the Conqueror was actually the Duke of Normandy. His name was William, the Duke of Normandy. He was kind of a distant relative to the Anglo-Saxons. He was kind of somewhat related to them. What happened was in October of 1066, he decided to invade England, what became known as the Norman Conquest. And he defeated the last Anglo-Saxon king at the Battle of Hastings, which happened in October of 1066. And the Normans then took over England. And feudalism, which was kind of starting in France at the time, then spread to England and all that. And he was later called William I, but a lot of people in Britain today still call him the other nickname, which is William the Conqueror overall. So yeah, the Normans take over England. That's something that happened. And so they're kind of descended, like I said, from the Vikings as an example. Then you got the Russians. Yeah, the Russians, a lot of the early Russian state was also descended from the Vikings as well. If you know about this, Vikings, they think as far back as, I want to say close to 900, or maybe before that, started exploring into Russia, like Ukraine and Western Russia, And the reason why the Vikings went into Russia was because some of them were trying to reach like where the Black Sea was, in the Byzantine Empire. Also, some were trying to seek like the trade in the Orient or Asia, like Oriental trade in the East. And so when they went into Russia, the local people, which are called Slavic peoples or Slavs, called them the Rus, R-U-S. Some people say Rus. It's usually pronounced Rus, R-U-S. And the term Rus was a term that meant to row, like to row a ship, because the Vikings were famous for their long ships with oars. And so that's where the term came from. And so the name Rush, actually the name Russia means land of the rowers, really, what it meant. But Rus meant Vikings, I guess. So land of the Vikings originally. But over time, the like Russian state and Russian people become a mix of peoples. Originally like a mix of Slavic type Eastern European peoples and Scandinavian peoples. And that's kind of what you get early on that create the early Russian state. The Vikings that actually came in were actually called another name, though. I think they called themselves this. They're called Varangians, is what they actually called themselves. But the people call them Rus, the Slavs. Over time, what happened was around the area where the Ukraine is, they eventually created a state there. It was called the Kievan Rus, is what they called the early Russian state, which was based where Kiev was. Kiev is the capital of Ukraine today, but Kiev was originally the capital of the early Russian state. And it was really not one state. It was actually like several states that were kind of together, more or less. They weren't really kingdoms, not initially till later. And the early state in Russia was founded by a dynasty that was called Rurik, R-U-R-I-K, which the Rurik dynasty was a very old dynasty. It's like something like 500 years old or something like that, or more. And it was ruled by these rulers, which were called princes or grand princes, or something called grand dukes. So it was kind of like a king, but it wasn't. And most of the rulers, like the grand princes that ruled over the Kievan Rus, were descended to the Vikings. They went back to the Vikings originally. And it's believed where the name came from was that they think the early ruler of the Vikings that settled in Russia, his name was Rurik. That was his actual name. He was some kind of king or chieftain of theirs. And he died about 890, roughly. You also had these other two rulers. Oleg was another Rurik ruler as well. And then you had Vladimir. He's called Vladimir the First or Vladimir the Great. They call him as well. That's why Vladimir is such a popular name in Russia today, like Vladimir Putin and Vladimir Lenin and all that. But Vladimir is important. If you read about him, he lived around about 1000. So he kind of, I think, lived between like the late 10th and early 11th centuries. And Vladimir was the one that actually converted all of the Russians to Christianity. He was heavily influenced by the Byzantine Empire nearby, which was south of Russia in the Black Sea. And so he decided to adopt their religion, Orthodox Christianity or Greek Orthodox, they also call it too. And so that heavily influenced Russia. And then also apparently Byzantine like monks came up from like the Black Sea into Russia. They took the Greek language, and over time it evolved into the Russian language, which was called Cyrillic, as they call it. And so, yeah, there's a lot of Byzantine, influence on Russia later, even their architecture and all that. Like St. Basil's Cathedral, if you've ever seen that in Russia, was heavily influenced by them, of course, later. So now, what happened with the Vikings? Well, the Vikings, it eventually came to an end. The whole Viking terror, if you want to call it that, that attacked Europe up to about the 11th century. And pretty much what happened over time was the Vikings eventually intermarried with, like, I guess, Christians in Europe. then they began to adopt Christianity and all that. And so they pretty much forgot about, all their pagan ways over time. But as I was saying that, about the whole, days of the week thing, like they got today, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday are all named after, Viking gods. Wednesday is Thor. Yeah, Wednesday is Odin Day. Thursday is Thor Day. And Friday is Frey Day. Thank God for Frey Day, huh? So, and of course, the Viking religion, they think, influenced Christianity. I think they think that the ideas of Valhalla are kind of somehow influential to like Christian, heaven and things like that later on. Right, I next need to get into, and I need to talk about the High Middle Ages. Usually the thing I talk about the most that occurs in the High Middle, which is really the most famous event that happens in the High Middle Ages, is the Crusades that occurs. So I'll mostly talk about that today. I don't know about what I'll get into later. Maybe we get into the Mongols. We'll see. I'm not sure we'll have time for that or not. But yeah, the Crusades was a major historical event that happened in the High Middle Ages. In fact, most of these military campaigns, which they were, occurred predominantly between like the late part of the 11th century into the 13th century. And they were a series of religious wars where, basically the Catholic West and Christians fought mostly Islam in the Middle East. And Islam was, of course, if you know about it, was a religion that was founded by Muhammad, the famous prophet who lived around the 7th century. And basically, they think from there, after Muhammad died, what happened was Muslim Arabs especially took the religion and started conquering territory and spreading the religion like into different parts of the world. And so they pushed into North Africa. They went to like Syria, Turkey. They pushed eastward all the way at one point to the Indus River, close to India, and also into where Spain is today. They went all the way, of course, over there. You saw that lecture the other day. I even tried to push into France at one point, but were stopped by the Franks. Now, Islam itself, the rise of it was important because it helped to really cause the decline of the Byzantine Empire. I didn't really get into that because I didn't have time, but the Eastern Roman Empire would eventually shrink and collapse due to the rise of Islam. In fact, it would be conquered by the Ottoman Empire later, almost to early modern times in the 15th century. And what happened was the Byzantines were having a lot of trouble militarily. They weren't able to really fight off all these, invasions. And so they basically asked the West, medieval Europe, Catholics in Europe, to basically help them, to send military aid and all that. And the main group that was mostly behind why they were having a lot of trouble was the Seljuk Turks. The Turks were a type of Caucasian ethnic people that had originated in what is Central Asia. They're kind of like, I think they seem to think that they were established somewhere around where the east of the Caspian Sea is. It was about where it was, an area that they used to call historically, which not really used as much anymore, but it's called Turkestan. It's like what would be Central Asia. It would be about where it is. It's kind of like above Iran and Afghanistan, about the area we're talking about in the world. And of course, the Turks were very warlike that came in. They eventually adopted Sunni Islam. They become Muslim, of course. And what happens is there was an emperor in the east of the Byzantine Empire. His name was Emperor Alexius I, or Alexius Comnenus, I think was his name too. He asked the West for help. I want military aid, to fend off all these Turks that are trying to take over. They want those lands back that they're taking, especially around where, like Syria, Israel, Turkey, those areas were areas that they wanted back. Especially the Holy Land, which was considered, sacred to the Orthodox Church in the East, and so the Catholic Church took it up. They responded basically to what Emperor Alexius I was, talking about. And so there was a pope, that, if you know about it, that decided to initiate the whole thing. His name was Pope Urban II. He came in he started making a bunch of passionate sermons, like preaching about how Christians in the West ought to try to help their Christian brothers in the East, and all that on behalf of the Byzantines. And so that's why you have all these Christians that start taking up the cross, for Jesus, and fighting for this cause, and so the people that fought for this, like Christians in Europe, were called Crusaders. Hence, because the word Crusader is a term meaning to take up the cross. It's kind of what it means. So they became Crusaders, and they think that Pope Urban II, he's pretty much the one that influences the First Crusade to eventually break out, which occurs over like a period of like 2-3 years, from 1096 to 1099. The First Crusade, by the way, was the most successful of the Crusades, which was maybe around 10 of them that they had total. And their main goal was to basically seize back most of the Eastern Mediterranean, like from Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, and Israel, those areas. And of course, especially take the Holy Land, like where Jerusalem is, was one of their main goals that they wanted to do, to take it from, of course, the Islam and the Turks and all that. There are actually two phases of the Crusades. The first one, there was this one where the People's Crusade. I don't know if you heard about the story, but a bunch of people got involved, just not really knights or anything like that, but just a lot of different social class, like peasants and so on, decided to band together. They started marching towards, I think towards like the Middle East, into like Turkey and Syria. And they were led by this guy named Peter the Hermit. He was kind of this Christian monk, and but they were all massacred. They never got there. They got killed. But they were notorious for, in fact, a lot of the Crusaders were kind of notorious for massacring anybody that wasn't Christian, like Catholic. Like if you were Jewish or Muslim, they killed you, basically. Then they had this thing called the Prince's Crusade. They had too, that which was part of the First Crusade. And this one was actually led by a bunch of princes that came out of Europe, which I think were mostly like French. Most of them were French knights that got involved. Although other states too, like the Normans as well, participated. I talked about before. There were some Italian knights, Germany, and I think from England there were some that came in too that also participated as well. And that was the most successful of that phase. And this crusade, this part of the crusade, of course, would eventually, by June, July of 1099, they would retake Jerusalem. It took about a month or so, but on July 15th, Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders. So, like I said, the First Crusade was the most successful of the Crusades. And one of the things that resulted from the First Crusade was that afterwards, what happened was the Crusaders came in and they created their own states out of the whole area that they conquered or took back from the Turks, Islam and all that. They established so-called Crusader States, or they have another name they call them Outremer States. By the way, is what they called them actually. Which Outremer, by the way, means it means overseas. Is what it means. Overseas states is what it means, because it was overseas from I guess Europe and all that. And there are four main states they created. You can see them right there. You've got the County of Edessa, County of Tripoli, Principality of Antioch, and then the Kingdom of Jerusalem. I'll put them on the screen for you, but these are the four basically that they, of course, created. So County of Edessa, County of Tripoli, Principality of Antioch, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Of the four in that list, the fourth one, Kingdom of Jerusalem, was the one that was the most powerful one. It was also the only one that had a king, because all the others you can see were either ruled by a count, that's why it's called a county, it's got a count, and a principality. But the other had, of course, a king. And it actually had a dynasty of kings that were related back to the French. In fact, the first guy I think that ruled was a guy named Baldwin the First, who founded it. He was a French nobleman. I think he was from Bologna or something. Bologna, I think it was Bologna, what is France, I believe. So that's basically the extent. And you can see from that map that the area that they conquered was mostly from what is southern Turkey down into Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and of course now what is called Palestine and all that today. There is one up there you see called the Principality of Armenia and Cilicia. That one was actually created by Armenians that were Christians. I think that had fled the Turks. They settled there. That's why Turkey has all these problems with Armenian peoples, because they're all living there. And I think the Armenians were originally living, I want to say, in eastern Turkey, closer to like where the Caspian Sea is in Georgia, the country of Georgia. Now, one thing that happened after these states formed was that, of course, they had to protect everybody, because most of the actual Crusaders went home. They did after the whole thing ended. And so what happened was they started creating these so-called military orders or medieval orders of knights that were created afterwards. And they were created for two reasons. One was they were developed there to protect the Holy Land, and they were kind of used as like the main troops. Basically, they were like shock troops, basically, is what they were in case of like battles or wars that broke out against the Turks again. And then also, they were also formed originally to protect pilgrims. So anybody that wanted to, journey there to the Holy Land and visit the sites where Jesus was and all that, they would protect them and all that. Of course, there was one group that was the most famous that they always talk about that's well known, and that was, of course, the Knights Templar, or Templars, as they're called for short. Probably the most famous medieval knights that there ever was. What happened there? But one of the most famous knights, of course, ever. And they, of course, were very well. They, of course, first of all, a little about them, a little definition about who they were, first of all. They were originally called the Knights of the Temple. That's their actual name, but of course, they shortened it to that over time. And it was actually a Catholic military order that was founded right after the Jerusalem was taken. They formed the kingdom. It kind of formed out of the kingdom of Jerusalem, they believe. And at one point, it had its headquarters on the Temple Mount, which is why it was called kind of like that name, Knights of the Temple, because that's where they have their headquarters. And I believe it was where the Dome of the Rock was, or is today, is where the actual headquarters was of the Knights Templar. They were very wealthy. If you know much about the Knights Templar, they're the ones that started the whole banking industry, Christian financing, throughout Europe, selling, loaning people money, and so on. So that's something that they were very much known for. They also acquired a lot of land as well. And of course, they were more known for their fighting skills. They were considered the best warriors, I guess, in pretty much in the Crusades and pretty much in the Middle Ages. That's that fight, and pretty much they were the shock troops. Is what they were. The Templars. They did have a symbol. Their symbol was a red cross. Something they're known for, and it's kind of where the Red Cross symbol kind of comes from. Later that you see in modern times, like the Red Cross organization. It's kind of came from there because they were known for charity, helping people out and giving money to people as charity also as well. They also had the Knights of St. John, who's also famous too as well, often called the Hospitallers. And they were famous for creating hospitals to aid a lot of the sick and maybe, pilgrims that might come to, the Holy Land and get ill. And they would, of course, take care of them and all that. They're also called the Knights of the Hospital. They're called all kinds of names. They're just the Hospitallers for short as well. So they had a white cross. And they had the Germans had their own order too. The Germans had the Teutonic order. They had a lot of these were knockoffs of the Knights Templar. They really were, like the Hospitallers and the Teutonic Knights. And they had their own cross too, which was the so-called Black Cross. So each one has a different color cross, if you notice that with that. And over time, the Teutonic Black Cross would evolve into the German Iron Cross. You know about that, which is later a famous medal that they give to soldiers in war. All right, let me go ahead and move on. Let's talk about, of course, what happened with the Crusades. Now, they had other Crusades. I don't really have that one too as a slide on that one. But after the First Crusade, they did have a Second Crusade that followed right after. That was caused by the county of Edessa. It actually got conquered right after it formed. It didn't last very long. That state, Turks took it. And in the 1140s, 1147 to about 49, they actually have a case where the Second Crusade was fought. It's an interesting crusade because it was one of the first crusades where kings in Europe started to really get involved, which they will later. And Louis VII of France, actually was the king at the time, sent forces along with Conrad III of Germany. He was the Holy Roman Emperor at the time. And they both sent forces, but they got beat. They got routed. They say the only thing that came out of the whole Second Crusade was that there were some Crusaders, I think, that left, I want to say England, I think it was. They were going to go sail to Syria to fight the Turks. They stopped off in Portugal and took it from the Moors. They seized it. And so Portugal would later become like a separate state over time. That's when Portugal was actually founded, which is in the 12th century. We don't know about that. That's kind of a side thing that, of course, happened. Then, of course, the other crusade that's big, of course, is the Third Crusade, which is really probably one of the most famous crusades after the first one that happened before. That was kind of a debate about which one's famous. I think this one might be more famous because of all the people that are in it. That's big. The Third Crusade was a crusade that lasted around 3 years. 1189 to 1192. It was actually caused by the Muslim Sultan in general, Saladin. It's also called Saladin, who had come to power in Egypt and also Syria. And he eventually retook Jerusalem in 1187 after like a siege. And so he recaptured it, basically. And so who was Saladin? I think I've got a picture of him if you want to look at Saladin. Saladin, it's got a longer name than that, but he actually was a sultan and founder of a dynasty called the Ayyubid dynasty. And he ruled over basically what is Egypt and Syria at the time. And anyway, what happened was he got enough military forces to eventually fight the Kingdom of Jerusalem's army. And what famously happened, that's well known, was there was a battle that was very important called the Battle of Hattin, which happened on July 4th, 1187. And in this battle, Saladin's forces crushed most of the Kingdom of Jerusalem's armies. They had the Crusaders and all. Most of them got wiped out in the battle. And so it allowed him basically to retake, Saladin was able to basically retake pretty much, everything in that region. And so most of Israel fell to Saladin. And so all these military victories that Saladin's doing, it makes a lot of the Europeans furious. They're really angry about what Saladin's done at that point. And so they decide to get directly involved. A lot of these European states and their monarchs realize that we don't do something, all of the territories that we've taken before will be gone. And so that's what sparks the Second Crusade. And the Second Crusade, by the way, has a nickname. It's often called the King's Crusade because of all these different famous kings that got involved directly. And primarily they're from 3 states that were involved that sent forces. England, France, and Germany, which you can see there, were the main states that participated in fighting against Saladin. If you want, I'll give you the 3 main ones, although I'm not really going to talk about them too much, but except for one of them. But those are the 3 main rulers in Europe that intervened and sent military forces Crusaders to fight Saladin. Richard the First, the Lionheart, of course, of England, he was the King of England, was the most famous. He was really the one that was most successful against Saladin. Philip II Augustus of France, of course, was another one. And then you have Frederick Barbarossa the First of Germany. He was also called Frederick the First. The first two there didn't like each other too much. Richard the First and Philip II hated each other. Richard had lands in France he controlled. Those two were constantly at war with each other, but they actually put their differences aside to fight in the war together. But over time, I think by the end of the war, Richard was the only one really fighting. The others, I think Frederick died, and then the other one, I think Philip went back to France later. But Richard was the one that fought the best. He actually fought Saladin to a draw in about 1192. And Richard was able to actually take the northern part of Israel back from Saladin, like the area where Jaffa and Accra is, which is in northern Israel today. But he wasn't able to take Jerusalem back. That was the only thing that was kind of a disappointment about what happened in the end. Here's a map showing you what the areas after the Third Crusade happened. So you can see there that, pretty much the area on the bottom wasn't taken back, like Jerusalem, Hebron, all that area, which they wanted to take back down there. They did agree to a treaty, which is interesting about this, in 1192, called the Treaty of Jaffa, where there was actually a 3-year truce made between Saladin and Richard I. And what it was is they promised each other they wouldn't fight each other for 3 years, the Christians and the Turks. And then also it would allow, actually the treaty allowed like pilgrims, like Christians, if they wanted to come visit the Holy Land, they wouldn't get attacked by the Muslim forces and all that. So they had one more crusade, which I'll talk about briefly. I've got a few minutes I can go ahead and talk about next. I need to talk about that one last. Maybe I'll talk about some of the other ones if I have time. But they had a Fourth Crusade. That one's not as well known as the first and third one. The Fourth Crusade was a crusade that was not very good. It was a disaster, what happened, especially for Christianity. And what happened in this crusade, which was 1202 to 1204, the Crusaders were supposed to attack Jerusalem and retake it through Egypt, which Egypt was like the center of where the Ayyubid dynasty was, that was founded by Saladin. And but what happened was apparently the Crusaders, if you know about this, turned on Constantinople and attacked the Byzantine Empire. Why did they do this? Well, apparently they had two problems. One was they owed a lot of people money. The Crusaders, they were in debt to, I think, the Italians and I want to say the Byzantine Empire. They owed people money. I think the Venetians, I think they owed a lot of money to them, I know. Then they also resented the Byzantine Empire because they weren't Catholic. They considered the Orthodox faith to be kind of like Christian heresy. It wasn't the same as theirs. And so what happened was they turned on them and attacked Constantinople and actually sacked the city in the year 1204. Yeah, 1204, April 1204. And they believed that the sack of Constantinople was a major event that happened in Christianity that's well known. It created this East-West schism that occurred between the Catholic and the Orthodox churches. And it's called all kinds of names. It's called multiple names. It's called usually the Great Schism is one name that they called it as well. And basically what happened was the two churches split permanently. They never got back together because one of the goals of the Crusades was to try to bring the two churches together, the Catholic and the Orthodox churches. And it just never happened after that. And don't confuse that with the Papal Schism, which happened later, like in the Middle Ages, like in the later Middle Ages. That's something totally different where the Catholic Church split into two popes, one in Italy and one in France. It's not the same thing. They usually call this one the Great Schism, where the two churches split permanently. Most of the Crusades were a failure. You know, they did have some other Crusades. There was one called the Sixth Crusade, I think, is one they talk about sometimes, where Frederick II, who was the Holy Roman Emperor, King of Germany, actually took back Jerusalem, but it was actually done through diplomacy, not through actually any military conquest. Apparently, in Egypt, they're having a bunch of revolts, and they basically just gave it to them in exchange for like peace, because they had their own problems. But they wouldn't hold it long, because within a few decades after that, it would fall again, roughly. You ever heard about the Children's Crusade? That was kind of a weird one. The Children's Crusade was one that happened in 1212, where a bunch of children tried to march on the Middle East as well. And it was kind of like the story of the Pied Piper, if you ever heard that story about that. And all these kids started marching toward the Mediterranean Sea to try to get on ships. And they thought that if all the like the Turks, Muslims saw the children coming, that they would just give up the land to them or whatever. But they made it to the ports in France, I think, on the Mediterranean Sea, and they were sold into slavery, believe it or not. But they had like close to 10 crusades. But overall, the crusades, like I said, were a total failure. It actually did the opposite of what it was supposed to do. It actually weakened the Byzantine Empire and Christianity. It really did. And then, of course, the Pope became less powerful afterwards. They weren't, in charge of, all these different crusades, which they kind of started in the end. And then you'll see Italy's later going to become the big thing afterwards. Italy's going to eventually emerge to become the power, and in Italy, with like their Florence and other states, Genoa, you got Venice, all those states kind of emerge in Europe, and not powerful, militarily or political, but economically, that'll lead to the Renaissance, of course, later. Got a few minutes left. I can kind of quickly review real quick, just over the stuff I did previously. I guess I could do that real quick, just those two slides right there. But why is the period after the ancient times called the Middle Ages? It's called that because of the fact that it's a kind of a between period that occurs between what is the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West, and then, of course, the what is the Renaissance or modern times. So it's kind of a Middle Age or medieval period that they call it, because Middle Age means middle age, Middle Age, basically. It's also called the medieval Dark Ages. So it's called multiple names. It covers from like 500 to about 1500 CE. 3 sub-periods is broken down into is the early Middle Ages, 500 to 1000. The high Middle Ages is 1000 to 1300. And then you've got the late Middle Ages, 1300 to 1500. So early, high, late Middle Ages is the 3 sub-periods of the Middle Ages. What are the main influences that made up the mix of culture that developed into the Middle Ages later, or New Europe in the Middle Ages? Mostly it was a combination of Germanic culture, Roman culture, and then, of course, the Catholic faith, which was injected into the region. Who were the Franks? The Franks were a type of Germanic people that settled Gaul, which became France. That became the kingdom of the Franks. Merovingian dynasty was the first dynasty of the Franks that ruled most of Western Europe. They were considered the first major Catholic state and dynasty that you have after the fall of the Roman Empire. King Clovis was the founder of the Merovingian dynasty in the kingdom of the Franks. He was also the first Catholic king in medieval Europe. What political military figures controlled most of the power behind the Merovingian king's power later? Yeah, they're called the mayor of the palace, or, of course, the Latin name is major domo. Charles Martel was an example of one of these aristocratic leaders that was famous, also called Charles the Hammer. Charles Martel was mostly a Frankish major domo in general. He was known for his military exploits, especially his defeat of the Moors. The Moors were Moorish peoples that lived in North Africa, who attacked and conquered what is Spain. They took over Spain. They were Muslim, and most of them were Muslim. And anyway, what happened was they tried to invade France to convert it to Islam. And what happened was in the Battle of Tours in 732, October 10th, Charles Martel defeated them, which was considered a turning point in, I guess, Western medieval history at the time. And it's famous because of the fact that it helped save, I guess, Roman Catholicism in Europe. What dynasty replaced the Merovingian dynasty? The Carolingian dynasty, which was named after Charles Martel, which was founded by Pepin III or Pepin the Short. Charlemagne was the son of Pepin III or Pepin the Short. He, of course, was the greatest king and emperor of the Franks. His name meant Carolus Magnus or Charles the Great. That's the original name he was called. In the French slur, his name is Charlemagne. What historical work written by the historian Einhard describes his reign? It's called The History of Charles or History of Charlemagne, either one. And Einhard was a Christian monk and historian who lived around the time of Charlemagne. How large was the empire of Charlemagne? Charlemagne's empire stretched from mostly eastern Spain and France all the way into Germany, and it also controlled Italy. It was later called the Carolingian Empire. What was founded in 800 AD when Charlemagne was crowned by by Pope Leo III? That was the Carolingian Empire, which Pope Leo III kind of helped create. And basically, the Carolingian Empire was it was supposed to be a continuation of the Western Roman Empire, but it was a Germanic version ruled by the Franks. What later name is it dubbed, which becomes most of the region of Germany, ruled by emperors later, sometimes called kings? Holy Roman Empire actually broke away from what was Charlemagne's old empire, and that was mostly based in Germany. Also, France would too. France would also break away too from Charlemagne's empire in the West. What was the result of the Treaty of Verdun, which was created by Charlemagne's grandsons? That was, of course, the sons of Louis the Pious, who ruled after Charlemagne. Basically, what happened was the Carolingian Empire was broken up into three parts. I told you how that created New Europe, because Charlemagne was considered the founder of Europe. And I told you that Holy Roman Empire in Germany broke away in the east, and then the Kingdom of France broke away in the west. I don't know if I have time to do all these. We just did all these today, the Vikings pretty much, and the Crusades. I don't have time today, but I'm going to talk about probably next week. I guess on Monday next week, I'll try to get in one more lecture real quick, which I'm going to talk about the Mongols, about them and what happens with that period. And then we'll talk about the late Middle Ages. So that's pretty much the main topics I'm going to have later that I will, of course, wrap up on, because it looks like it's going to be one more lecture on the Middle Ages coming up, part 3. So that's it for today. Like I said, if you have any questions about, of course, the lecture, let me know. Of course, about anything, comment, question about it, whatever you've got overall. If you have administrative questions, let me know, of course, via email about that. That's pretty much it for today. I think the only thing you got big, assignment-wise right now is the last final vocab, of course, to work on due Monday, November 30th. But like I said, Monday next week, I'll have one more lecture coming up to wrap up the semester. And I probably will try to give you your exam early if I can, that week of Thanksgiving. You can start working on it because it's going to be due, later at the end of exam week, final exam week. So that's it for today. Y'all take care, and hope I'll see you, of course, later on overall. So take care.